One of my most memorable moments was when we bombed a target in Austria and got shot up with anti-aircraft pretty well. And so I lost 2 engines of the 4 on that flight, and B-24s don't do so well with only 2 engines. So we had to leave the squadron almost immediately, and we're lagging behind. And the gunners down on the ground were trying to pick us off as we trailed off into the distance. I alerted everybody in the crew that be prepared in case we have to crack up or try to land on land or possibly ditch in the Adriatic. So but we made it. Fortunately, we landed at our home base in Cerignola, Italy, and we got out to walk around the plane and see what had happened, realizing that we had also been hit in the hydraulic system because we had no brakes when we landed, and found that we had a 6-inch hole through the wing. A shell had gone completely through and on up, and either did not fire or else it was high enough up so there was no damage to us there. It was a good day in that it all turned out all right, but it was a little scary.
There were prisoner of war camps all over the Far East, and people were starving and needed medical attention badly. And so the 20th Air Force, in a 10-day period, flew 1,045 missions to reach 169 POW camps with 149,000 prisoners of war. And on the night of September 1st, we were assigned Naoetsu, Japan. And intelligence said, we think there's a prisoner of war camp there, but we don't know for sure. You're going to have to find it if it's there. And we came around, and at 800 feet, we dropped the first load in a rice field right next to the camp. Came around the second time, and that's when the men had started to run for the food. But we saw this one guy out there getting everybody back because he had been a bombardier. He saw our rear bomb bay doors open. He knew that we were going to drop something. I found out who he was, and he was Louis Zamperini, a captain in the U.S. Army Air Corps, who crashed in the Pacific and spent 47 days on a life raft. And then I learned 3 years later that he had been in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. He was a world-class track star and well-known. And so 40 years later was when I met him in person, and he was the hero in my experience.
The person that I admired most all through my training and such was the President of the United States. To me, he had an impossible job. He had allies and he didn't have allies, and we had two different parties, as you know. So he stood up against them and did his work and more than that, and I'm very proud to be able to say that.
The one person that impressed me while I was in the Navy was while I was in the hospital. Our chief naval officer was Captain Stelter. He had been on the USS Hornet at the time it was sunk. And he was related about the time when it was sunk. He waited until the ship, the deck got that water level, and he stepped off into a boat rather than jump.
I remember in one situation where we were pinned down, and the lieutenant, a fellow named Bond, incidentally, which is a pretty famous name these days, but he was no relation. But he was a really good officer. He was the last guy out, and he stood with us in the combat situations at the front. And he was one of those guys, you go first and I'll see you later kind of people. He told us we had to move out and return into the town, and we were pinned down, and we were crawling up to this roadside thing. And as I came to it, there was a fellow in front of me. He got up and he started to cross the road in order to get to the other side, where the theory was we would dive back into the continuing ditch and crawl on back into the town. The problem was that he took a bullet in the head about halfway across. And of course that made me rather nervous, so I knew I was next to go. And the lieutenant was right behind me. He was the last guy out of there that day. And I started to get up, and then I thought, wait a minute, this might be the last moment in this lifetime. So I backed up and stayed down for another few seconds. Then I thought, I've got to do it, I've got to go. So I jumped up onto the road, ran across the road. Instead of diving into the ditch, I cut to the right on the road, zigzagging right, left, and indifferent, and I ran all the way into town. When I got there, I noticed I was carrying my rifle. I didn't even know I had it with me at that point, but I wasn't thinking about it.
For us, the war was still on. We got to Hawaii, or Honolulu. We're met by all the leis and all the bands and whatnot, and we're sent to an officer's quarters to unpack and get ready for whatever awaited us. We heard a lot of noise, banging, shooting, and we all ran outside to see what was going on. The war was over. That's my big story. We arrived the day the war was over with Japan.
One of my most memorable experiences was when we had our first kamikaze attack. We found our ship had been singled out because we knew that two of the planes, one was coming at us from the aft and the other one was coming towards us from ahead, from forward. And they apparently just kept on coming. We aimed all sorts of anti-aircraft fire at them, but they just kept on coming and coming and coming until the one ahead of us, coming in from the front, seemed to waver a little bit, but he went on past the island. He was coming from ahead, past the island, and then he turned, so that he crossed us first, crossed the flight deck, then hit the gun mount on the left side over here. And then he hit the gun mount and destroyed the gun mount and about 35 men in it, and then went into the ocean. So we never saw what was left of the plane, but it did explode. And so it put a little hole there. It wasn't enough to really damage us, and we could keep on operating. And then the one in the rear just, he didn't quite get to us, and they had him shot down just rear, so his explosion did a little damage, and it killed a couple of guys back there that had been shooting at him, but otherwise that was a total damage to the ship. We were kind of shaken up, but you just keep doing your job when something like that happens, and you're able to, you just keep doing your job, and that's what we did. But it was quite an event, and the plane hit us about 50 feet away from where I was in the radar. So you could feel it, you could really feel it.
One mission in which we were a pathfinder. And the idea of that was, and it was Tokyo we were going to bomb. It was a blackout all over Japan, so you couldn't really tell where the cities were very well or what part of a city. So the job for us was to drop some incendiary bombs that would start a fire, and then about a half hour later the whole fleet of aircraft would come, having seen the fire, know where to go. But now this is a night mission, so we could, by coming through over Tokyo Bay, you got that land and water definition, so you could know exactly where you were. But you didn't really want to fly there because they had what they call flak islands in the bay and on the shore. And by then they dropped us down to altitude, and the main armada would come in about 12,000 feet. But to make sure we got it right, had to go down to 5,000 feet. And we were the fourth plane in, and we could see each one of the three ahead of us were shot down before they got anywhere. So we got through that, but we had 48 holes in our aircraft when we got back from that.
Interesting incident on the way out there was when we stopped at Anahuac. There was a landing strip on the atoll. One of the young second lieutenants asked me if I'd like to go for a ride up above the area where hundreds of ships were located. We were having a beautiful cruise, and all of a sudden a plane went by. And my pilot rolled over behind that plane, and I rode in the back seat for a dogfight. And it turned out the pilot of the other plane was Colonel Harper, our group commander. And it was an interesting experience.
The most memorable occasion, not a moment, but was the landing in the northern Philippines, which was a big armada of ships, hundreds of ships. And as we came up the west side of the Philippines, we came from the Solomon Islands across and through the middle of the Philippines and up the west side to land on the northern part of Luzon. And there were a great many Japanese planes over bombing and strafing, and our planes after them, and anti-aircraft and all kinds of shooting. It's chaos and worse, and you see these Japanese planes coming down. I'm sure every ship thought they were coming right at them, and you say, no way they can get through all this. The amount of shooting is just unbelievable. And sure enough, sooner or later, almost all of them would get hit and pieces of the plane would fall around you, but nothing big enough hit us anyway to make a big difference.
I was especially active in some Civil Air Patrol activity. The toughest part of the mission was in flying protection for the convoys. When we would fly by them, we would see them on the deck waving at us, and we stayed with them as long as we could, as long as our fuel supply permitted. And then when they turned east and went out into harm's way, and we were able to return to a safe haven, it was pretty tough to do.
Because we were one of the last divisions over, we were selected to go to the Pacific after the war in Germany ended. And so we were the first division to go back to arrive in New York. And because we were the first one, even though we'd been in combat only 42 days, we received a hero's welcome. We had blimps in the sky. The Secretary of War came out on a special boat. There were fireboats and tributes as if we were the greatest division in the world. And we received a 1-month furlough at home and reassembled at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, to go to the Pacific. And while we were there, the atomic bomb was dropped. It was a big surprise, of course. A lot of my buddies thought Adam was spelled A-D-A-M. But anyway, in spite of the Japanese agreeing to surrender, they sent us over to the Pacific anyway, and we ended up in the Philippines.
And I spent the next 8 months in Luzon, Philippines, and then came back.
One of my memorable moments was when my roommate and I hitch-hopped on leave. In 1943, I had, or 1944, I had gone by train from Jacksonville to Fargo. Going home, then back to Jacksonville, we decided to go 5 days early and to hitch-hop again. So I went down to Sioux Center and we went to Omaha. And very soon a very nice young colonel came and said he would take us because we had said we wanted to go east. We decided we had 5 days, we could go any place on the East Coast. And he said he was going to Miami eventually, but he had to stop in Cincinnati for 2 days. And if we had time, why, we could fly with him. But our memorable moment then came